Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 178 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cebulski, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. In the mid-1990s, thanks to a little Oscar-winning movie called Braveheart, the world turned its attention to the story of the Scottish Wars of Independence, introducing a whole new generation to the names Robert Bruce and William Wallace. But one of the first things anyone dipping their toes into the medieval world today learns is that that particular movie can't be depended on for much in the way of historical information. The Wars of Independence are a fascinating moment in European history and a pivotal moment in the history of Scotland and the United Kingdom. So I wanted to find the right person to introduce us to the real story. Enter Dr. Iain MacInnes. Iain is a senior lecturer and program leader at the University of the Highlands and Islands, who has published extensively on medieval warfare, especially that between Scotland and England, as well as insurrection and the depiction of the medieval in comics and graphic novels. He's also the author of Scotland's Second War of Independence, 1332 to 1357. Our conversation on why a sovereign kingdom had to fight for independence in the first place, an often forgotten figure key to the First War, and why we need to look to the decades beyond the Battle of Bannockburn is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, Iain, for joining me to talk about the Scottish Wars of Independence. I'm excited about this. Thank you so much for coming on.
No, thank you very much for having me. I'm always happy to talk about my subject of interest, so hopefully it will be of interest.
It will be of interest. I'm telling you this right now. Definitely for me and definitely for the audience as well. So when I talk about a subject with an expert, I like to really make sure that we're situating it in time and space. So if we're talking about the Scottish Wars of Independence, we have the location pretty well. What time are we talking about?
The wars themselves start in 1296, so right at the end of the 13th century, and will linger on for at least the next half century, although Anglo-Scottish antagonism probably continues on into the 15th century, to be honest.
Okay, so when we're talking about wars of independence, Scotland is its own country. Why is there a war of independence to begin with? What touches this off in 1296?
There's quite a long lead-in to things. So originally we have the death of King Alexander III in 1286 without any surviving children. His last direct heir is a granddaughter who dies 4 years later on her way to Scotland, and then that is the end of that long-lasting dynasty, and with no obvious succession. So there then begins a 2-year process to choose who the next king should be, and involved in that is King Edward I of England, who is there to help ultimately, but has his own designs on what he can get out of the process. And Scotland gets its new king. King John is chosen, the right choice at the end of the day, despite lots of comments in modern material suggesting otherwise. But Edward has John over a barrel, rather, and as part of the agreement by which Edward helped choose the king had to then recognise English overlordship over Scotland. And the question of overlordship has been kicking around between England and Scotland for over a century. It's not a new issue, but it's one that's kind of been swept under the carpet a few times. But the selection of the new king brings this back into the open and gets Edward what he wants, which is recognition of that. And so he's able to put pressure on John. John, at the end of the day, has to do as he's told or else, and the Scots end up deciding they've had enough. They make an alliance with the French, and with an English army massing on the border, the Scots take the decision to raid into England, and Edward takes that as all the excuse he needs to invade, at which point the war begins. So there's a long lead in. There's quite a lot of factors contribute towards it, but that's why it starts, I think.
So can you elaborate just for a second a little bit more on why Edward would be involved in this process at all? So it's an independent kingdom. Why would Edward be mixed up in it at all?
I think Scotland is in a completely unforeseen situation of not having anybody effectively who is related to the crown, or else the relationship goes so far back in the family histories that it's impossible to know who has the best claim. And that is an unforeseen and, I suppose, unforeseeable situation. And Scotland then is being run by a collection of guardians who are trying to keep the kingdom stable. But there is the possibility of civil war breaking out within Scotland between different claimants to the throne. There are two principal families involved, the Bruces and the Balios, and they both think they have the right to be king. There are plenty of others as well. And I think against that backdrop, the Guardians decide we need help with this, and they don't have the authority because they're just other Scottish nobles and Scottish representatives. So having somebody come in from the outside seems sensible. Edward's done this kind of thing before. He's helped with a succession dispute on the continent. And relations between Scotland and England in the 13th century have largely been quite good. And Edward has been friendly enough to Scotland, so they don't necessarily foresee a problem with what they're doing, or at least they're desperate enough that Edward is the obvious choice to make.
It's funny, I'm thinking about this, and Edward is a lot like a vampire. You don't want to invite him in because once he's in, he's in.
Yeah, you do. I mean, I often discuss this with my students. You do wonder about that decision. You know, the Scots have seen what Edward has done previously in Wales, and I suppose you do wonder if they had second thoughts about it early on. Or as I said, or if it's just desperation, there isn't an alternative, and this is the way they have to go because the alternative is too difficult to consider.
Exactly. I think it would be hard to be sitting in Scotland and not be looking at Wales and thinking, this could be disastrous.
I mean, I suppose they may look at it and say, but we're different. As you said, Scotland has been a kingdom of long standing, and so it may well think that it has enough capital in the bank that it doesn't need to worry about such things. But if that's the case, then that's a miscalculation.
It is a miscalculation. So for the people who only have Braveheart as a touchstone, and I mean, no shame, it was such a big movie. It is a cultural touchstone. This is the time we're talking about. So Edward is the king that was called Longshanks. He's the one who is now an aggressor. He's taken this as an opportunity to try and take over Scotland. So we now have a few characters that are really familiar to everyone. Tell us a little bit about how this unfolds.
So Edward is originally very successful. He takes an army into Scotland, sacks Berwick-upon-Tweed, wins a battle at Dunbar, all in 1296. And after that, the Scots largely surrender. And Edward, to all intents and purposes, thinks that's it done. He's conquered Scotland and that's the end of it. But yes, Scotland is never quite so easily reduced in that regard. So yes, the following year you have a series of rebellions across Scotland, both in the north and in the south. And in the north you have the forgotten character somewhat of Andrew Murray, and then in the south you have William Wallace at the head of those rebellions. And they win a victory at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, defeating an English army, although without Edward. Edward is not there at the time. And that, of course, then prods Edward into acting again, wins a victory at Falkirk the following year, and then proceeds to try and continue his conquest of Scotland. But things quite quickly settle down into something of a stalemate. Falkirk is not the decisive victory that Edward might have thought it was, just the same as Dunbar wasn't 2 years before. And actually conquering a kingdom the size of Scotland is immensely difficult. So Edward does have to work with various Scots who surrender to him and agree to work for him. But even then, there's continued opposition as well. And that will continue until peace is kind of agreed in 1304. But then, of course, that only lasts for 2 years. And then Robert the Bruce pops up and he decides to rebel instead. And the English will see that time and again, that no matter how many times you think Scotland is conquered or Scotland is settled, somebody else comes along and rises in rebellion, and the whole thing kicks off all over again.
It's true. I think that's what you're talking about. Geography is a huge factor. It is a big country. It has a lot of different terrains in it, and the terrains become really important. So let's talk about the Battle of Stirling Bridge for a second. So this is a funny one in Braveheart. There is no bridge.
There's no bridge. I know that's my chief complaint all the time.
But people really talk about terrain in terms of Stirling Bridge and the tactics that the Scots take on. So tell us how the Battle of Stirling Bridge happened.
Yeah, so the Scots set themselves up in a situation where they can ambush the English army. It's absolutely not as it's depicted in Braveheart. It's not two armies running full tilt at each other across a field. Although it makes for a fantastic image, which I show to students all the time. But no, it's not how it was done. And the Scots camp out in a wooded area where they can monitor the English procession across Stirling Bridge, but they wait until part of the army is across and then march out to ambush the element that's crossed over. And so is able to defeat that smaller force on one bank while the rest of the English army is still stuck on the other. And then typically as well, those Scots who are within the English army, because as I said earlier, plenty of Scots surrender and help the English. They take that opportunity then to change sides, and so you end up with the with the other half of the English army also being attacked from the rear. So it all ends pretty badly for that English army, and it's a pretty resounding success for the Scots. But yes, it's a victory in very specific circumstances, and it's an ambush. It's not actually a battlefield victory as such.
I think that the impression that you might get from watching something that has either two armies running at each other, or they tell the story of Braveheart, where it seems to be coming as like a peasant story, the uprising of peasants. This isn't really how it happened. These people who are behind it actually had tactical experience, right? So this is our opportunity to talk about Andrew Murray as well as William Wallace. So go for it. Tell us about Andrew Murray and William Wallace.
So Murray is the man who kind of rises in rebellion in northern Scotland. He's Andrew Murray of Och and Petty, so in the area of the Black Isle, just north of Inverness. And Murray is a figure who is well off financially, but not in the premier echelon of the Scottish nobility. And actually, that's quite a key thing. In the rebellions that break out in 1297, it is the men of the second rank within the Scottish nobility who rise, men with less to lose, in as much as they don't have titles and earldoms perhaps to lose. And what you do get is that the major Scottish nobility, by and large, stay out of it because it's not safe for them to do so. And you get the second rank, or indeed lower, of characters who rise up instead. So Murray very much represents that in northern Scotland, and Wallace in the south. Wallace, not the kilt-wearing peasant that Gibson would have as belief, minor landholder, or his family minor landholders, and Wallace rises in the south. And also the suggestion as well that these men are not working independently just off their own back, that they are actually being sponsored by the major Scottish nobility, who again can't act out themselves because it's too dangerous, but they can encourage others to do so instead. So you have the suggestion that Murray is acting on behalf of the Commons in northern Scotland, and Wallace perhaps acting for Bruce and others in the south. And those two men attract other Scots to serve with them. As you say, not men who are completely without experience, or at least without some element of training. And then those two men bring their forces together, and that's what leads to Stirling Bridge.
I think it's important to recognize that, because it's an irritation to me, as I'm sure it is to you, when people imagine that Scotland is backward at this time, when it is on par with all the other societies at this time. So it's important to recognize that there is battle experience in here, and that the tactics that they choose, for example, at Stirling Bridge, are not because they don't understand a pitched battle. It's because this is the best tactic for the terrain and for the situation.
Yeah, I mean, the Scottish military doesn't have long experience, certainly. I mean, before the wars begin, apart from internal political wranglings, the last kind of battle of any major size would have been the Battle of Largs in 1263. So there is something of a generational divide. But Scotland is a kingdom where, yes, there is a system of defence and military recruitment embedded within society. Men are expected to serve for certain lengths of time, and that gets men from the elite all the way down to the lower classes. Where Scotland's at a disadvantage against England is that it has a smaller noble corps, and it's that noble corps who will produce the cavalry. And so with fewer men, and fewer men who are well off, your cavalry arm of that army is smaller, and you are a bit more dependent then on the levies, the feudal forces, for want of a better term, that would be called up to serve in extremis. And yes, they are perhaps less experienced and less well trained, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't function. It's a system that works for centuries in Scotland, so it can't have been completely useless.
It's true. And the nobility, we should also point out, is really tangled up in the English nobility, especially in the borderlands, right? So this also makes it very difficult to gather up an army of cavalry when you have people with really divided loyalties.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, the Wars of Independence is something of a watershed, because as I said before, Scotland and England actually had decent relations over most of the 13th century. And so, yes, you have Englishmen who possess lands in Scotland, Scots who possess lands in England and in Ireland. And yes, those familial contacts, intermarriages between nobles on both sides of the border, which absolutely create all manner of issue when these two kingdoms go to war, and when that war then starts to become prolonged. It'll be one of the actions that Bruce takes in the later period that rather cuts that cord and establishes that kind of post-war, post-96 reality, which is you cannot be both. You have to be English or Scottish. You have to be loyal to one or the other. You can't have it both ways. But in the early years of the war, that's still an issue these men are having to wrangle with.
Yes, exactly. Well, and then over the next 50 years, there's a lot of reason for wanting to pick the side. But you're mentioning the Bruce. This is a good time to talk about the Bruce. Tell us about the rise of Robert the Bruce, because it, again, is not something that was necessarily inevitable.
No, I mean, Bruce is an interesting figure. I mean, it's his grandfather that originally is the man who wanted to be king during the Great Cause proceedings, those 2 years of trying to decide who the next king would be. It's Bruce's grandfather who is the man who tries to be king. And when the decision goes against them, the Bruces don't forget, and they continue to promote themselves at various points. But I mean, Bruce is also, he does rise in rebellion in 1298, although he also surrenders pretty quickly afterwards. Again, has a bit too much to lose, but again is also fighting with the rebels in the period afterwards. Surrenders a couple of times to the English, surrenders again in 1302, and stays on the other side thereafter. Ultimately, because it's his political rivals that are essentially forming the patriotic core. So there's not much in it for Bruce when it's his rivals that are leading the charge the other way. But that rivalry comes to a head in 1306. So after peace has been kind of tentatively agreed in 1304, Bruce and John Comyn of Badenoch come to blows at a meeting where they may have been discussing who the next king should be or who should mount the next challenge. Come to blows, Comyn ends up dead. And that propels Bruce towards rising in rebellion to try and seize the kingship for himself, but also creates an almighty mess. An already unstable situation amongst the Scottish nobles becomes so much worse because there's now a state of feud effectively between the supporters of Bruce and the supporters of Comyn, and all of that against the backdrop of Bruce's rebellion and ongoing conflict with England.
There are a lot of people that have a lot of ideas around this killing. What's your impression of what happened? Do you think it was just a brawl that ended badly?
I don't. Well, I suppose I do have to say one thing or the other, don't I? I think the natural I think the natural inclination is to think that yes, that Bruce ultimately needed something to come of that meeting with Comyn. Obviously, it doesn't necessarily work out particularly well for him. It puts him completely on the back foot, and he will spend the next few months on the back foot, and that leads to a series of defeats. So I suppose he wouldn't have chosen that moment. Also, Edward I is still alive. Although the old king is nearing his end, and the Scots probably knew that, which is why these discussions are taking place between the rivals in 1306. But he's not gone yet. And I think if you have any sense at all, you'll wait until after he's gone before you take any action. That does suggest that Bruce didn't necessarily plan it. But I think at the end of the day, Comyn had to go, unless they could come to some sort of an understanding. And the previous 10 years of fighting between the two would suggest no, not really. So that's not necessarily an answer, but it's something.
Well, I just wanted your impression of it because it is such a pivotal moment that people spend a lot of time thinking about. Was this pre-planned? Was this murder? Was it manslaughter? It does kind of make a difference, but in the end, it happened and we have to go from there. So we talk about having the first War of Independence and the second one. What brings the first one to a close?
I have had a conversation with another academic about this, and actually his argument is that the first war is that period from 1296 to 1306, and that Bruce's war is the second war, which is actually probably a better way of putting it than I've put it, because the period I study then is the period from 1332, which is the war restarting. So the second war in that sense is the ghosts of Bruce's war coming back to haunt Scotland. The various things that Bruce thinks that he has fixed during his own reign haven't really been fixed at all. And that those various people that he angered through his murder of Comyn, and indeed their extended families who he banished from Scotland, and whose lands he took away to give to his supporters, they come back to Scotland in that period, that power vacuum that is created after Bruce's death, and when the new king, David II, is only 8 years old. That's how the second war, as I quantify it, I suppose, starts.
Okay, so there's contention around this too. So yes. Do we think that the death of Edward I, for example, kind of brings this period to a close because Edward II is not he's not terribly good at fighting, and he ends up backing off from this. Do you think that might be where people are thinking that this is, at least the war between these two countries, is coming to a stalemate for a little while?
Yeah, I think Edward the First's death certainly acts as a watershed. Yes, I mean Edward has been incredibly focused in trying to conquer Scotland and has spent considerable amount of time and money trying to make that a reality. And he is stupendously angry when Bruce rebels. His actions towards Bruce's extended family, he has most of the male members killed, executed, female members of Bruce's family who come into his control, imprisoned. The two examples of the women who are put in cages for public display. He is supremely angry that this has happened, that all his work is being undone again. I think, though, that, as you say, once Edward dies, though, you get into the reign of his son, who is not his father, and ultimately is not as successful. And that does change the whole nature of things. And what you have in the period from 1307, from Bruce's return to Scotland after a short period of exile, is that Bruce recovery. Over the next few years, Bruce systematically takes on and defeats his Scottish enemies. He's given time to do so because Edward II is not particularly interested in pursuing things in Scotland. He has enough issues at home to deal with. And then Bruce takes the war to the English as well, and also successfully.
So when you talk about him taking the war to the English successfully, what time are we talking about now?
So Bruce rebels in 1306, has a series of defeats, is chased from Scotland, essentially disappears off into the Western Isles and indeed potentially to Ireland, returns to Scotland in 1307, and his campaigning begins from then onwards. And so, yes, it's the period then from about 1307 to 1309, 1310 is when he is fighting his Scottish enemies by and large. And then from that point onwards, it's then taking on the English, reducing English garrisons, capturing English-held castles in Scotland. And indeed then from around 1312, starting to take the war to England itself by sending Scottish raiding parties south into England to visit war and destruction on the English kingdom as a bit of payback for what Scotland has suffered up to that point.
So at this time, where are people drawing the border between England and Scotland? Because this is a border that kind of shifts over time. So when the Bruce is drawing a line and saying, from here, this is Scotland, from there is England, and we're going to raid it, where are we talking geographically?
So I suppose Bruce would want the border to be back where it was in 1286 at the point of Alexander III's death. Largely where it is in the west, but in the east, the border should be south of Berwick upon Tweed. Berwick should be part of the Scottish kingdom as well, and at this point in time is not. Has a nice big English garrison in it, as have various other Scottish towns and castles like Edinburgh and Stirling and various others. So yeah, there's plenty of work to be done, and Bruce certainly does systematically go about doing it.
Yes, he certainly is systematic when it comes to making sure that he's reconquering the things that he feels belong to the kingdom. So then things settle down a little bit because, as you say, Edward II of England, he's busy for quite some time. And then his son comes to the throne and things start to heat up again. So tell us your definition for your book, at least of the Second War of Independence, starts in the 1330s. So what touches this off again? You've given us a bit of a clue, but get into this for us, please.
Yeah, so Edward II is overthrown towards the end of his reign by his wife and her lover, and they then reign in place of the young Edward III. And it's that regency government that makes a peace with Scotland. The treaties of Edinburgh and Northampton are agreed in 1328, which recognises Scotland's independence, something that Edward I and even Edward II would never countenance. That they marry off Edward III's sister to the young David II, so there is that marriage alliance between the two kingdoms. Various other elements are brought into play, and the Scots in return are going to pay this large sum of money to pay the English back for all the damage they've done in England, although largely it's also because it's the money that Isabella and Mortimer are after. But that peace is one that doesn't go down well in England. and particularly with Edward III himself. And there is that notion, it's known as the shameful peace, that this has been agreed, that England stoops so low as to agree peace with Scotland rather than just conquering it. So Edward III is miffed, and a few years later, in 1330, he stages his own coup, overthrows the regime of her mother, and seizes the throne for himself. And helping him in doing that are various members of what are referred to as the disinherited. So that's those Scots and Anglo-Scots and indeed Englishmen who lost their lands, lost titles in Scotland during Bruce's reign because they refused to support him. They're the ones who were exiled from Scotland and whose lands were granted to Bruce's supporters. And they've been wanting some recognition of that, certainly some grant of those lands back. And there may well have been some negotiations to start that process during the peace negotiations, but they're never brought to a conclusion because we're dealing with so many lands. There's so much territory that's changed hands. And to take it off of loyal supporters, to give it to a bunch of people who are completely against the Bruce dynasty just wouldn't work. So it's a rather unresolvable situation. And leading all of this, or the disinherited group, is none other than Edward Balliol, who is the son of King John, who reigned for 4 years from 1292 to 1296, was dethroned by Edward I. But Edward III makes rather useful use of the young Edward to say, well, here you go back to Scotland, take your throne back. And he gathers a force around him, including the disinherited, and they sail to Scotland, invade Scotland in 1332. And it's that civil war within Scotland that restarts. It's essentially refighting the war that Bruce had been fighting from 1306 to 1310. It's that kicks things off again. And then Edward III himself joins the war a year later, and then it becomes an Anglo-Scottish conflict, as well as a civil war, which makes things very interesting.
Makes things worth writing a book about, right?
Well, I would argue so, yeah.
So I have to ask, because this is the time where Edward III is also looking at France. He's starting to think about his inheritance there. So what role does France play in this? Because there is always this old alliance, right, between Scotland and France. What role do they play in this?
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I mean, the Scots and the French have been allied since 1295. One of the things that actually leads to war starting in the first place. But the alliance has never been particularly productive for the Scots necessarily. What the French do provide the Scots at some times, but not all the time, is diplomatic support. So the French can lean on the English diplomatically. Certainly, the English possessions that are left on the continent can be pressured. And the French can also act with the papacy to help provide diplomatic support to poor old Scotland. But beyond that, the Scots don't necessarily get too much from the French. And you do get the notion that the Scots are useful for the French whenever they need help, and it doesn't necessarily work reciprocally. But during the period of the 1330s, certainly, which is when Scotland is at its lowest ebb in terms of the Bruce dynasty, the French do step up. David II and his court goes into exile and is welcomed by Philip VI of France. David and his court are put up at Chateau Gaillard and spend 7 years there before he returns to Scotland. And the French do lean on the English diplomatically, which helps the Scots no end. And there are supplies coming from the continent in terms of weapons and money. That becomes more so as time goes on. But you're absolutely right. Things become more complicated again when Edward III then starts to get bored of his adventures in Scotland, which aren't necessarily working out as successfully as he might have assumed, and then starts to look to, as you said, his own succession potentially to the throne of France, and indeed to the 100 Years' War that will begin. And so what you get then from after 1338 is the war in Scotland is effectively another theatre in the 100 Years' War. But of course, that creates all manner of problems for the English, because that alliance between Scotland and France then works very well. But Edward III can't ever go to the continent without worrying about his rear. That is a constant concern for him for the next few decades.
I think it's important to remember that, because as much as Scotland is to the north and not attached to the continent in any way, they're very much attached when it comes to alliances, when it comes to trade. And that really becomes a factor in the 100 Years' War, especially when you have England on both sides getting that pressure. Yeah, it becomes really important. So David II doesn't spend a whole lot of time in Scotland, relatively speaking. Who is in charge while he's away?
So Scotland has a series of guardians who control the kingdom in the king's absence. For the first several years, I mean, there would have been a minority anyway because David is too young. But in the 1330s, Scotland goes through a succession of guardians, usually because the guardians end up dying in battle. So you have the Earl of Mar, who's killed at the Battle of Duplin-Bour. He's succeeded by Andrew Murray Jr., the son of Wallace's companion. He's captured in battles, so it then passes to Archibald Douglas, who's killed at the Battle of Halidon Hill. So it then passes, this goes on for quite a while. So not the most stable situation. Scotland perhaps has its best periods of guardianship under Andrew Murray, who is, once he returns from English captivity, will eventually become guardian again and succeeds from 1335 to his death in 1338 in mounting that kind of recovery, again pushing the disinherited forces back, defeating the disinherited forces in a smallish battle at Culblain, and starting to retake those English and disinherited held castles, mostly in southern Scotland. But then, of course, Murray ends up dying, I think, of something nasty he's caught while besieging Stirling Castle. And so it then passes to Robert the Steward. Robert the Steward is an interesting character because he's the nephew of the king, but also a rival. He is his heir apparent, and the two, from a relatively early stage, don't get on. And so you then have the competing desires of the steward in charge in Scotland and the court of David II trying to do its damnedest to make sure that the steward doesn't have freedom of operation. So yes, Scottish politics never goes away, and the Scots never manage to bury the hatchet between themselves long enough to focus fighting on the English, and that is a recurring theme throughout, I would suggest.
At the same time, it is remarkable that with all the infighting, they still managed to hold off a country that has a lot more people and a lot more resources. It's pretty impressive that even with the infighting, they're able to hold as much ground as they do. I think that's kind of amazing.
Yeah, no, it is. I think the ability of the Scots to bounce back as well from a succession of defeats is quite impressive. I said they have those two at the start of the Second War, that they have those two defeats within the space of less than 12 months and lose two guardians and a lot of Scottish nobles, but they continue to come back. Even after the defeat at the Battle of Neville's Cross, David II himself captured, several Scottish nobles killed, captured. There is the danger that things will go back to the 10 years and it'll return to 1332 all over again. But it doesn't happen. And part of it is Scottish or Bruce Scottish resilience, certainly. And part of it, though, is also that the disinherited aren't necessarily as convincing as alternatives as they might be. I think they're perhaps more dangerous than people assume them to be at various points. But the longer the war goes on, the less likely they are to succeed. And Edward III, I think, starts off with grand ambitions over what he would like to do in Scotland. But I think ultimately he gets bored. And it's certainly, he can't afford to continue throwing money at his Scottish efforts because it costs a fortune, the war he's fighting in Scotland, and to little financial end. I mean, the war he ends up fighting in France at least produces quite a lot of money for the English coffers, even though it costs a lot of money to prosecute it. But the war in Scotland isn't even providing that. So yes, I think he starts to look elsewhere, and the Scots are able to take advantage of that.
Yes, they're always good at taking advantage at this time. And you have to be scrappy, especially when you have, threats all over the place, whether they are from different families internally or they're from external threats. So we're talking about the Second War for Independence. How does this resolve? So we've talked a lot about how Bruce's family rises, how it struggles. How does this resolve? Because you have picked an endpoint for your book. So how do we see this resolving in the end?
So the Scots are defeated outside Durham at the Battle of Neville's Cross in 1346. David II, having only been back in Scotland for 5 years, then spends the next 11 years in English captivity. But there's an irony, though, in the fact that David II, as a prisoner of Edward III, is only as valuable as his status. And if Edward III continues to say, well, you're not actually the king, Edward Balliol's the king, that doesn't work. It doesn't work politically, it doesn't work financially. And so the ultimate irony is that if Edward III wants to extract the maximum he can out of the situation he finds himself in with David II in his possession, then he actually has to recognize him as king and has to deal with him as king. And that leads to a prolonged series of negotiations over several years, but which eventually lead to the Treaty of Berwick in 1357, which leads to David II's release, his return to Scotland, in return for a huge ransom that David will spend the rest of his reign paying. And ultimately that stops the war. It, I think, achieves everything that Edward III might want from it, in that he gets a massive financial injection out of it, and he gets a peaceable Scotland to his north so that he can turn his attention back to France again. And that comes at a rather important time, post Battle of Poitiers, but before the Treaty of Bretigny, so you have that situation where Edward is really pushing the situation in France, can potentially see a final victory in France. So to get that victory over the Scots, to get that peace arranged with the Scots, and to essentially take the Scots out of the war is incredibly useful for him. So yes, that's the end point. 3057 essentially is the end point. Of course, it's not the end of Anglo-Scottish antagonism. It just puts a halt to things for the rest of David II's reign. Once David II dies, things change again.
It's always going to be a tumultuous period. I don't know how people settled in those borderlands and ever felt safe, because there are raids going back and forth for centuries.
Yes, it's not the safest part of the world to live in. That is why you start to see the building of, in England anyway, the building of more or different types of castles to try and deal with the unrest, to give yourself somewhere to retire to that's relatively safe, somewhere that can survive, a raid at least, and you can take your goods and possessions in so the Scots don't nick them, which the Scots will do on a regular basis. And there's archaeological evidence as well, though, of whole communities just picking up and leaving. And yes, I think it is a period where that border region is essentially one of refugee populations at its peak. You have both sides attacking this same part of the world. When you're getting it from both sides, that must be a horrendous situation to be in. And indeed, yes, why would you stay? You would go somewhere else to try and seek some element of safety and security.
It would just be one of those times where if you're passing through, for example, you'd want to wonder on a daily basis who's in charge right now. If you had to travel and bring your goods somewhere, you would always have to be on guard, I think, not only for individual bandits and raiders, but for whatever conflict is happening at the time. So as this conflict with England starts to settle down, there's a peace. How does Scotland do politically at this time? How are they rebuilding? Do they become stronger than before? Can you tell us a little bit about how Scotland builds itself after this peace?
I think David II's reign is not necessarily known for being hugely successful. I think in part because he doesn't produce an heir, and so the dynasty then ends up changing again after his death. There are various bouts of political infighting within Scotland, which comes back to that poor relationship between David II and Robert the Steward, and which filters down into the Scottish nobility, as the nobles also pick sides and perform their own roles within that. Again, Scotland is able to have some element of recovery. The war that's fought is immensely destructive, but it's also one that can be recovered from in relatively short time, as long as it's, as long as we're dealing with crops and things. And even the famous quote from Froissart, who says that the Scots don't care that the English burn their houses, because they're so poor and so rude that it doesn't take them more than 3 days to rebuild it. And obviously that's a damning with faint praise comment by Froissart. He's just saying how rubbish Scotland is, and that they all live in hovels anyway, so it doesn't take any time to recover. It's not that simplistic. But yeah, it's a destructive war, but it's destruction that can be recovered from, as long as it's not, large scale pieces of infrastructure and things. When you have armies targeting mills and barns and things, that has a longer lasting impact on things. Scotland can recover. What Scotland has the problem with is that it has to pay this massive ransom for its king, and David II has to impose taxation on Scotland. Scotland has not been used to being taxed regularly before this time, really. It's paid through necessity when that's been required. What the war has managed to do, especially during Robert the Bruce's reign, is that the Scots have been able to gather a large sum of money by raiding Northern England. But of course, that's now closed off to them because peace is now the order of the day. So yes, it's an interesting time. It does recover. Things do have to change a bit. But poor old David spends the remainder of his reign, by and large, trying to unsuccessfully produce an heir, and ultimately trying to stop Robert the Steward succeeding him as his king. And ultimately, he fails to do that.
It's funny because it's not funny as in hilarious, because it led to so much destruction, but it started with a succession crisis, and then it ends with a succession crisis, which is interesting in retrospect, because David II is married to Edward III's sister in order to create this peace. And still, despite everyone's best marital efforts, this piece is something that has to be built and is still unsteady.
No, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, David is not a great husband, which doesn't help. And indeed, Joan spends various lengths of time in England, and David has various mistresses. You do then get the notion that if anyone has an issue in terms of producing the heir, it's him, because he does remarry and does have mistresses and things, that there are no offspring at all. So yes, that would appear to be not through his fault, but it's David's issue. But yeah, absolutely, that idea that yes, the marriage alliance between Scotland and England, not for the last time, should guarantee peace between them going forward, and of course then doesn't.
No, it doesn't. Well, this is such an interesting period in Scottish history, and it is obviously one that people are very interested in. We have Braveheart, of course, we have Outlaw King, and so I'm really excited to have you come on and tell us a little bit more about it, especially the Second War of Independence, which doesn't get a lot of airtime. So thank you so much, Iain, for coming on to tell us all about it.
Thank you very much for having me. That's great. Thank you.
To find out more about Iain's work, you can visit his faculty webpage at the University of the Highlands and Islands, which is a bit too long to read out, but which I'll have for you in the show notes. Iain's book is Scotland's Second War of Independence, 1332 to 1357. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's up this week, Peter?
Hey. Well, first, I guess I found this wonderful little study about a 13th century Danish axe and how it was like this unique weapon of war. Like it could stab you, slash you, hammer you, hook you, like all in one, right? It was this very unique piece. And so there was kind of a little research just talking about it. We have a couple of really in-depth articles. The first by Carol Hildenbrand on the infamous assassins, or more accurately, the Zari sect. They were based in Syria and Iran. I've always really loved Carol Hildenbrand's work, so I was really happy to have her write this for me. It was originally from Medieval Warfare, but it's sorting out the fact from fiction for the assassins. So I was really happy to have that. And also we have Tonio Andrade, who looks at the invention of gunpowder in China and how firearms developed in China as well as Europe, and the kind of differences and similarities. And I thought it was another really good article. So lots of stuff to kind of check out.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I think people are really going to be interested in learning more about assassins and definitely gunpowder too. And this magical weapon that can do everything.
Indeed. Yeah, it's all fun and games here.
Sounds perfect. Okay, thanks, Peter.
Thanks.
Thank you, as always, to everyone who supports this podcast via medievalist.net's Patreon page. Patrons can access all sorts of fun stuff like subscriptions to the Medieval Magazine and Medieval World Magazine, as well as ad-free versions of this podcast. As a bonus, you'll also receive eternal gratitude from yours truly. To become a patron, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from Bruce to Spruce, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or Twitter at Medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cebulski, on social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of How to Live Like a Monk, Medieval Wisdom for Modern Life, in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Geefrog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself an amazing day.